Hi, folks. I wanted to share some more thinking out loud, if you'll indulge me, this time on the theme of good enough is great. I've been a big advocate of this theme over the years, over many years. I think it was sort of one of the roots of the digital transformation of business, of the economy, and of learning, or it should have been of learning, perhaps, although I think learning in L&D was a little bit slow. So the idea that, we identify a problem, probably the most valuable problem, get a minimum viable product out there, which is a first step to solving as much of that problem as possible. See how that goes, iterate quickly. On the basis that this is good enough to get started, but it's not perfect. So good enough is great, but we're enemy. The perfect is the enemy of the good, as they say on the other side of this. Focusing on metrics clearly, so clearly measuring whether good enough is still being achieved and what could be better. I think focus on user metrics is often the most significant. Most progress was made in the digital revolution there, although not only there. Learn what works, that learning word again, and then iterate constantly, constant development and improvement. This was kind of the engine of digital transformation, really. This idea that good enough is great. Let's get started. I remember having a significant debate, if not argument, with some senior editorial folks at the BBC about the principle of good enough is great. They weren't keen. For them, good enough means it's ready to go on air, and there's only one definition of that. We know what that is, and we only go live when it's not necessarily perfect, but when it's of a sufficiently high quality. Editorial, I think, is a different sense of what good enough is. I'm wondering now whether good enough is still great, though. We're thinking about this sort of generative AI or AI transformation that the learning and development industry is chewing on, wrangling with, excited about, frightened of at the moment. And is good enough still great? I think it's a little bit more open to question now. I think it's certainly, quicker and cheaper is being achieved. I think that's the revolution that we're undergoing. Really, is that the process of getting learning live, whatever that means, learning experience, solution, program, course. It's now much, much quicker and cheaper, and it's getting quicker. And whether it's going to get cheaper or not, but it's getting quicker, certainly. There's this interesting theme, and in a lot of the interviews we've been doing recently, and some research around generative AI with corporate learning folks, this idea that democratization of learning is now more achievable. So putting design and production tools into the hands of subject matter experts is now democratizing the creation of assets that can be then wrapped into learning, or perhaps the creation of the learning experience itself. I think it's an interesting idea. I think against that, there's anxiety that you just give these powerful tools to anybody, and AI slop will emerge, and the sort of the slop will rise. The tide of slop will rise, but it kind of depends who it's from. Against that, I think a lot of people are placing learning and development, learning design specialists as the gatekeepers of what's good enough, which tend to balance against that idea of democratization. But then, what does good enough mean? And is that good enough clear enough? Is that measure of good enough clear enough? Versus those kind of sharper metrics in the digital transformation, digital product transformation. I think there's something to wrestle with there about what does good enough mean? Is it actually what do we compare good enough to? I think often in conversation we tend to compare good enough to some kind of ideal solution that's out there. Is this good enough to be perfect? Is this good enough to be the best? I don't think that's the point. I think these generative AI tools, generative AI content is substituting what's good enough as part of a solution, or good enough as part of a workflow. And that's being, good enough and quicker and cheaper. That's kind of interesting. And I think that's where sort of the foundations are being chipped away at a little bit, perhaps. But I think it's interesting what do we compare that to? Do we compare it to humans best? Do we compare it to the best solution? Actually, if we compare it to the industry standard, the industry average, then perhaps it is good enough. And I think that's a real challenge that we're wrestling with now. I think there's a really interesting debate around efficiency and effectiveness. Is this effective learning, even though it's quicker and cheaper? I think that's a bit of a red herring, actually. I think effective should be the standard anyway, whether it's mobile video, AI. Effectiveness should be the goal anyway. So I think we can get maybe a little bit caught up on that, which isn't necessarily helping us see what's changing in the industry. Accuracy, I think, is a really interesting challenge, though. These generative AI models, these tools, these technologies actually aren't focused on truth. They're not focused on accuracy. They're focused on probability. They're predicting what the next best token is. And quite often enough to me anyway, just get it wrong and aren't trying to get it right. They're not trying to be true. And I think that's a really interesting challenge. The sort of, I don't want to sort of suggest that we're on a quest for truth, but we are on a defense of accuracy, I think. And that accuracy, correctness, however you might define it, truth with a small t, perhaps, I think that's a really, really powerful and interesting benchmark of what good enough is. I think my last thought on this, for now, anyway, is that this idea, and I love the idea that you can have quick, cheap, or good, but you can only have two. I wonder, like, is this now quick, cheap, and good enough? Is that really the sort of the revolutionary change for learning and development? Quick, cheap, and good enough. I think it feels like that's what's really sort of nagging away at the change for the industry. And how do we redefine or define what good enough is to defend against that, sort of rising tide of adequacy? Anyway, those are some thoughts thinking out loud. Inconclusive, I realise, but I'd love to know what you think as well. So if you've had the time to listen, do let me know.